Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the year 1982, and I think it's safe to say that a lot of those new styles of music that had started to become developed in the later part of the 70s are now firmly established and much more commonplace in early 80s music, with the prevalence of different styles like synth pop, post-punk, gothic rock, post-disco, and new wave, just to name a few. And it was just a very cool and very experimental time for music. And I gotta say, of all of the years that I've covered in this Top 5 Albums series up to this point, this is probably the year that had the most surprising choices. When I was going through and narrowing it down to my top 5, I definitely picked a couple that initially I was not expecting to find on this list, so hopefully there should be a couple of surprises throughout this video for you. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1982, starting with number 5. Coming in at number 5 is the ever-popular Tortured Artist Effect by Todd Rundgren. I really enjoy this record, and despite the fact that this record was written and recorded in a pretty rushed fashion due to contractual obligations, I think it still resulted in some very amazing and very high-quality Todd Rundgren songs. Stylistically, this album is in a general pop rock sort of realm with lots of amazing different electronics and synthesizers, and similar to other records from Todd's discography, he played all of the instruments himself and did all of the production on this record. And production-wise, I think he did an incredible job. Oftentimes with a lot of artists and bands, you do see their production work start to suffer a little bit once we get into the decade of the 80s. And Todd Rundgren is one of those artists where I think his production remained really consistent throughout almost all of his discography and really didn't take any dips when we entered into any new decades. The album is 9 tracks long, and I wouldn't regard this as a perfect record from front to back. It does have a couple of tracks that I could do without, but I do think I would say about 85 to 90% of the songs on here are absolutely incredible. I think side 1 is pretty much perfect from front to back. It opens up with one of the 2 singles from this record, which is a song titled Hideaway, and this is an absolutely beautiful and powerful song to kickstart this album with. And then side 1 delivers 3 more tracks that are all of very high quality, but also have nice contrasting moods and feels, with Influenza, Don't Hurt Yourself, and There Goes Your Baby. Side 2 then delivers 5 more tracks, 4 of which are originals, and 1 which is a cover of a track titled Tin Soldier by the 60s group Small Faces. And that would actually be an example of a cover song where I like it even more than the original. I think he did an amazing job on that track. And the most noteworthy song to come from side 2 and from this entire record would be Bang the Drum All Day. And this is a song that a ton of people have heard before, but a lot of people are not aware of the fact that Todd Rundgren actually wrote this track. And it's kind of a funny story as to how this track came about. According to Todd, he had actually heard this song in a dream, and he woke up in the middle of the night. He couldn't get the song out of his head, so he went down into his home studio, and he just worked hours on end until he was able to completely recapture the sounds that he was hearing in his dream and reproduce it into a song. The thought of hearing that song in a dream, I think, is pretty humorous, and it's just an interesting story as to how that song came into fruition. And I wouldn't say that this is a favorite Todd Rundgren track of mine, but on the flip side, it is a track that was able to get him a lot more mainstream attention and maybe expose him to an even wider audience of people. So I think the song was a success in that regard, but I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Todd Rundgren tracks. My 2 favorite songs from side 2 would be the cover of Tin Soldier and a track titled Drive. And like I said, I don't think it's a perfect record from front to back. Side 2 has a couple of tracks that I'm not crazy about, but I think side 1 is pretty much perfect from front to back. And I think 85 to 90% of this record is incredibly strong. And I think it was another very good follow-up to a string of really consistent albums that Todd had released in the later part of the 70s and the early 80s. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Todd Rundgren's entire discography, I did a video ranking all of his studio albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist, linked in the comments and the description if you are interested. All right, that is my number 5 album. Now on to number 4. Coming in at number 4 is the album 2 Rye A by Dexy's Midnight Runners. This is a band that I've been aware of for quite some time because of their big hit Come On Eileen, and they're a group that I've never been intrigued enough about to really want to explore their albums, but I have a book titled 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die, and I've been going through that for a couple of years trying to listen to all of the records from that book, and I've noticed multiple albums from Dexy's Midnight Runners popping up throughout that book, and one day as I was flipping through the book I decided, I might as well listen to one of their albums, see what I think of their sound, and I was very pleasantly surprised with everything I heard. This album far exceeded my expectations. Musically and stylistically, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on throughout this. It's this interesting blend of pop, Celtic, folk, blue-eyed soul, and new wave. Instrumentally, we have the typical guitar, bass, drum, vocals, and keyboard setup, but we also have the addition of some less commonly used instruments, at least by 80s music standards, with the addition of banjos, saxophone, trombone, flute, and most importantly, violins, which are a very prevalent part of the overall sound of this record, and in my opinion, a key ingredient to the unique sounds that these tracks give off. The album is 10 tracks long with 5 songs on each side. For side 1, I think it's pretty much perfect from front to back. I love all 5 songs on here. Each song is unique and distinct on this side, and each song contrasts one another beautifully. My 2 favorites from this side would be All in All and Jackie Wilson Said. And I do think side 1 is a bit stronger than side 2. I still think side 2 is great, but it does have one track that I could do without. But there's still 3 very solid songs on side 2, with my 2 favorites being I'll Show You, as well as the classic hit Come On Eileen, which is the closing track to this album. And as a kid, that was a song that I never really took seriously, but now listening to it with this newfound appreciation for Dexy's Midnight Runners, I can say that is a very solid and very uniquely written pop song. So of all of the albums that have made it onto one of my top 5 lists from this series, this is probably the record that I am most surprised has popped up on one of these lists. But I gave it a chance, and I'm very happy that I did, because I think it is a very good and very unique album to come out of the early part of the 80s, and it would go down as my number 4 favorite album. Now on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is New Gold Dream by Simple Minds. This is one of the standout records to come from this Scottish band, and it's also considered one of the defining albums of the new pop movement of the early 80s, which was a British pop movement that consisted of a lot of different styles that were rooted in the post-punk influences of the late 70s, and it was comprised of numerous different artists who had achieved mainstream success in the early part of the 80s through MTV. Stylistically, this album is a great fusion of a lot of the different styles that had been established in the late 70s and early 80s, with a mixture of new pop, new wave, synth pop, and art pop, with beautiful synthesizer sounds, very colorful vocal melodies, and just overall very tasteful and very catchy songwriting. The album has a really great pacing to it. There's a nice blend of songs that are a little more stripped down and ambient, as well as a couple of darker tracks, and a couple of more dancey and poppy sorts of tracks that do a really great job of giving us a lot of twists and turns from one track to the next, and really keeping things exciting and engaging. The record is 9 tracks long with 5 songs on side 1 and 4 songs on side 2. For side 1, my favorite song by far would be Promised You a Miracle, one of the best new wave and synth pop songs of the early 80s in my opinion. And I also really love the closing track of side 1, which is a very cool instrumental titled Somebody Up There Likes You. A really fascinating sounding song from a musical perspective, and all of the interesting and exotic synthesizer sounds that they are exploring are on full display all throughout this track. Side 2 delivers another 4 amazing songs, and my favorite on this side would have to be Glittering Prize, which I would say is probably the most poppy and mainstream sounding song on this album, and again does a great job of contrasting the more ambient and more darker tracks very effectively. And I also really love the track that follows that up, titled Hunter and the Hunted, which takes a more dark turn and again just shows a very effective juxtaposition of all of these different moods throughout this 9-song track listing. And I think it offered some of the best and most creative sounds that early 80s music had to offer. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 is The Nightfly by Donald Fagen. This was the debut studio album to be released by Donald, who was the co-founder and lead vocalist of Steely Dan, and this came out about 2 years after Steely Dan would release their final studio album for quite some time, titled Gaucho, and I think he did an amazing job for his first album under his own name. Musically, it's got all of the classic Steely Dan flavors all throughout this record. We've got Gary Katz on production, who had done production for all of the Steely Dan records up to that point. So in terms of the overall sound, you will definitely enjoy this record if you're a Steely Dan fan. The one area where it does veer off a bit is the lyrical content. A lot of the Steely Dan lyrics are more character-based, whereas this album goes into some more personal territories with a lot of commentary around being a kid growing up in the Cold War with the threat of nuclear war always being present, and how Donald tried to maneuver around that and make sense of that as a kid growing up in America. The album is 8 tracks long with 4 songs on side 1 and 4 songs on side 2, and I think it is incredibly concise and cohesive from front to back. Musically, we have the very colorful and jazzy chord movements, really tasteful grooves, as well as amazing vocal melodies and harmonies, and we have tons of amazing guest features happening from track to track with top-tier artists like the Brecker Brothers, Jeff Porcaro of Toto, Anthony Jackson, Rick Derringer, Larry Carlton, Chuck Rainey, and Marcus Miller, among many others. As far as favorite songs from both sides would go, my 2 favorites on side 1 would have to be the opening track, IGY, which I think is the most perfect song he could have opened the album with, and my favorite song from this record. And I also love the track Maxine. That one has some really interesting chord progressions going on and incredible vocal harmonies. For side 2, my favorite would be New Frontier, which sounds like a song that could have easily been on a Steely Dan record. And my other favorite would be The Goodbye Look. I think that's a very interesting song from an instrumentation and groove perspective, and it adds a nice little variety in the track listing. But I do not think there is a bad song throughout this 8-song track listing. I think Donald Fagen knocked it out of the park with his first studio album, and he took all of the momentum that had been established with Steely Dan and delivered something that I think is very satisfying to the Steely Dan fan, but also offers a couple of things that are new and unique to Donald Fagen and his sound as a composer. So that is my number 2 album of 1982, and now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1982. Alright, coming in as my favorite album of 1982 is Thriller by Michael Jackson. I know this is probably the most cliche choice that I could have made for this year, but after going back and re-listening to this album, I think it's pretty hard to argue that this is not a masterpiece of a record from front to back. The Michael Jackson record that was released prior to this one was Off the Wall, and that album was very successful at the time of its release, but Michael Jackson did not seem to be satisfied with the way everything turned out for that album. And he had become really determined to become the wealthiest and most popular person in show business, and he had made it his mission to record an album that was comprised entirely of hits with no B-sides throughout any of the track listing. And I think it's pretty obvious that he had achieved that goal with this record because it almost plays through like a greatest hits album. And it's one of those records where as I'm listening through it, I am constantly in disbelief as to how many popular Michael Jackson songs all came from this one album. Stylistically, we get this really great blend of pop, rock, funk, and R&B with amazing production from Quincy Jones. The album is 9 tracks long, and it features a great blend of tracks that were written by Michael Jackson with Wanna Be Startin' Something, The Girl Is Mine, Beat It, and Billie Jean, and the remaining 5 tracks were written by a few different songwriters. The placing of the dancier, more higher energy tracks against the ballads is done in a very effective manner, and from front to back, I do not think there is one skip over track anywhere throughout this, and almost every song on this record is regarded as a classic Michael Jackson hit. From a musical standpoint, we have some really talented musicians popping up throughout this album, like the Porcaro brothers and Steve Lukather, who were part of the band Toto, as well as a couple of surprise guest features like Paul McCartney and Eddie Van Halen. As far as favorite tracks of mine would go, my 2 favorites would be The Girl Is Mine and Baby Be Mine. And for side 2, my favorites would be PYT and Human Nature. Human Nature is probably my number 1 all-time favorite Michael Jackson song. I think it's a beautiful song with so many great melodies and interesting chord changes. And it was actually written by Steve Porcaro of Toto, so that's a little fun fact about that song. And PYT is very interesting from a groove perspective with all sorts of twists and turns and intricate rhythmic figures happening throughout it. And it's the perfect dancey, high energy track to set up the closing track, which is The Lady in My Life, which is more of a ballad. But from front to back, I would say this album is just about perfect. I can't find any flaws in it. It doesn't have one song that I think is a skip over. And almost every single track on here is now regarded as a classic Michael Jackson hit. So I know it's cliche, but that is my number one favorite album of 1982. So to recap, at number 5, we had the ever popular Tortured Artist Effect by Todd Rundgren. At number 4, we had To Rye A by Dexy's Midnight Runners. At number 3, we had Gold Dream by Simple Minds. At number 2, we had The Nightfly by Donald Fagen. And at number 1, we had Thriller by Michael Jackson. If you haven't heard any of these albums and you check them out, please let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. And please let me know what your top 5 favorite albums of 1982 are. I would love to see your lists. All right, that is it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 albums of 1983. I'll see you then. Take care.